The story we are about to discuss is one of the most disturbing stories I have ever covered. No creative intro for this, just a warning. This video is going to discuss very sensitive subject matters: mental health, religion, and possession, as well as a crime so disturbing that police involved were, and still are, haunted by what they witnessed. While I'm going to not go into graphic detail, even slight details are enough to give a person nightmares. Before I begin, there are a lot of people using this picture for Michael Taylor. I am pretty sure it isn't him because papers around that time used this image, which looks nothing like the first one. I also found this other picture as well, so I'm going to assume that people are mistaken in using the first picture I showed you because that is the one that comes up on Google. This happens a lot. Think an image is authentic only to later find out that it isn't. Either way, not many pictures of the people involved in the story are available, so I'm using a lot of stock footage in this video. And before we begin, here's a red panda. Why? Because this is going to get dark. It is going to get disturbing and a bit twisted, and we all need this. So here again is a red panda. Let the cuteness overload before the horror. Michael Taylor was described as a normal family man. Loved to play with his children. Loved to play with the family poodle. Born and raised in Ossett, West Yorkshire in the UK, he never really left that town. Michael was a butcher by trade, though some people have stated in videos that he was also a handyman before he was a butcher. In those tellings, the reason for the switch from handyman to butcher was because he suffered a back injury. Either way, he did have a back injury, and in 1974, he found himself without work. At that time in the UK, jobs were scarce. Unemployment was high. He had an uphill battle with having a back problem. Because of this, he suffered a Great Depression. A nosy neighbor named Barbara Wardman had taken notice of these bouts of depression, and she thought that she had the perfect idea to help Michael Taylor. Ossett at the time was a religious community, made up of mostly people who attended the Anglican Church. Yet the Taylors were not churchgoers themselves. Barbara Wardman suggested that the issue was more spiritual than physical, and that what Michael needed was a healing. Suggested that he and his wife attend a service that was held by a group with no name. It was just a Christian fellowship group. Unlike the Anglican Church, which is pretty boring, and much like Catholic Mass, this Christian fellowship group was more like evangelicals you see today, singing, dancing, and having fun in the name of the Lord. Michael and his wife Christine Taylor agreed to go to these meetings, which was led by a 21-year-old woman named Marie Robinson. While Marie Robinson isn't the villain of this story, she did unintentionally set in motion the events that followed. I honestly think she had no idea what she was playing with when it came to her fellowship group. This fellowship group was of all ages, from 20 years old to the elderly. They would meet in the homes of the congregants and pretty much was almost cult-like. Marie claimed to be able to heal people. She also spoke in tongues. And when Christine and Michael went to one of those meetings, they were met with a sight that would enthrall both of them. Marie had a presence, so when she called upon the congregation, asking if anyone needed to be healed, Michael stood and walked towards her. She would walk towards him. But she stopped at an old lady named Mavis Smith who was crying. She would lay her hands on Mavis and speak to her in tongues. Then Michael surprisingly ended up doing the same. Michael Taylor had never been a man of faith before. He had never been a man who even spoke anything but English. And yet he was there, speaking in a tongue that was foreign to him. Not saying that he was speaking actual words in a different language. More likely was things off the top of his head. But from then on, both the Taylors would attend the group. Just like cult leaders though, Marie Robinson had a darker side. One of her favorite things was exorcisms. But before I go on, I need to explain the differences between an Anglican version of an exorcism and the Catholic version of an exorcism. Catholic exorcisms are done in Latin. mostly involving holy water and crosses, whereas Anglican exorcisms are called deliverance and are done in English with laying of hands. But for the sake of this video, I'm just going to call them exorcisms. Both, though, have strict guidelines, and they can only be done by professionals. In both, the individual who is possibly possessed needs to go through a psychological evaluation to first rule out mental illness. The 3 ways of telling possessions are: the individual knows a language that they did not know before, the individual has knowledge that they possibly couldn't know, and the individual has an aversion to signs and symbols like the cross. Marie Robinson wasn't taught how to look for signs of possession. She had no formal teaching or training through the Anglican or Catholic Church. She just assumed that she could do it. This can be insulting to anyone of those religions, but also can be dangerous for those who are suffering from mental illness of some sort. It is a highly stressful situation and should be respected. One night at the home of the Taylors, the group met. Mavis Smith was in attendance, and again she began weeping. Marie pounced on this opportunity, whether for her own ego or to genuinely help the person. It really doesn't matter, because she attempted an exorcism on Mavis without really taking into consideration that she might not be possessed. Then, when it seemed to fail, Marie just moved on like nothing happened. This greatly disturbed Christine, who broke away from this group. It was because of this break that Christine noticed that her husband wasn't as interested in the group and faith as he was Marie herself. Michael and Marie would sit up all night during the full moon doing signs of the cross to one another, mostly because Marie claimed that her powers were weak during the full moon, and both feared the full moon, which is weird as all hell. He spent a lot of time with Marie, and even once said that his love for her was a Christian love, which again is weird as all hell. But to Christine, there was a lust in her husband's eyes when he looked at Marie, and Marie was not about to set boundaries with Michael. Marie seemed to encourage it. When Michael was with Marie, he was happy, he was joking, he was jovial. When he wasn't, he was miserable and depressed. Christine had had enough of this, and like any good wife, she would confront Michael and Marie. She had hoped to break the spell Marie had over Michael, but what happened wasn't what she had hoped. It was in the Taylor's own home that Christine confronted her husband in front of the entire group. Even the group had noticed that Michael seemed less interested in Jesus and God than he was Marie. For their part, it was an open secret. Christine suggested that Marie and Michael go to a different room and work things out, to which both agreed. Michael, possibly thinking that he was just given a free pass from his wife, attempted to kiss Marie, and Marie rebuffed him. He was 10 years older than her and married. According to Marie's testimony later, she attempted to get him to give up on it and go back to his wife. When he finally agreed, they returned. Michael proudly proclaimed that they had both conquered their desires. But then, something snapped in Michael. Marie saw it in his eyes. His eyes began to change. Marie started shouting at him in tongues as he yelled at her in tongues. He attacked her, slapping her and pulling her hair. Christine and the others attempted to pull him off of Marie, and kept commanding him to stop in the name of Jesus. Invoking the name of Jesus seemed to snap him out of it. And from Michael's words, what happened he doesn't remember. He blacked out. He claimed that he was standing there, and then he looked down and he saw himself naked. Then he turned to Marie, and then she was naked, and then he blacked out. Realized they weren't actually naked, it was just what he thought he saw. The next day, Marie came back to the Taylor household to forgive Michael for what had happened, but Christine demanded she leave. And that is when Marie left their lives. For 2 months in 1974, Marie was a part of their lives. Michael seemed to be enthralled by her, and it angered his wife. I have seen this theory make its rounds when it comes to this case, that if it wasn't for this moment and what is to come, Marie Robinson would have become a full-blown cult leader. But it was this, and what is to come, that brought her down, because she later would be accused of being a secret Satanist and drawing demons into her congregation, and that Michael was one of the possessed. Michael Taylor would, after the events of that night, end up getting worse. He destroyed all the religious symbols in his home. He would wander the streets, screaming that he had seen the devil. He was getting worse. And his wife had decided the best course of action was to get him to go on a vacation. But that is when Barbara Wardman re-enters our story. If you don't remember, she was the nosy neighbor from earlier who got them into the Christian Fellowship group in the first place. I think Barbara had the best of intentions, but she was way too religious for her own good. Barbara went to a local vicar named Reverend Peter Vincent and told him of the strange goings-on at the Taylor home. Reverend Vincent deduced that Michael was possessed and an exorcism was needed. Reverend Vincent was the type to give anyone exorcisms when he felt that they needed it. He went to the Taylor home where he met with Michael and Christine. There he found that Michael was changing his story. Michael complained that it was Marie who had been the one to seduce him, and it wasn't that he lusted over her. This was also where the accusation that Marie was really a Satanist came in, as Michael told the Reverend that. Christine, for her part, did not correct her husband. Her annoyance with Marie blinded her in this instance. Reverend Peter Vincent believed them. When Reverend Peter Vincent left, he decided that Michael needed an exorcism. But the Taylors were going to be leaving for vacation, so he needed to act fast. So, conspiring with Barbara Wardman, they lured Michael and Christine to St. Thomas's Church. On October 5th, 1974, the exorcism began as a surprise to Michael and Christine Taylor. Reverend Peter Vincent assembled a group to help him. Methodist minister Raymond Smith, Raymond's wife Margaret, Reverend Peter Vincent's wife, and an assistant named Don James. Michael didn't take this with a grain of salt. He became violent, throwing tea at the Reverend and punching him, as well as kicking a cat. Side note, you harm animals, I automatically hate you. They ended up tying Michael and took him to an office. They laid him on some cushions on the floor and began the exorcism at midnight, meaning he was tied up for hours, laying on a floor. They shoved crosses in his mouth. They made him confess to sins he never committed. They took his own cross, which was an old wooden one, and set it on fire, claiming that it had been perverted by the demons that Marie put inside him. All in all, they claimed to have drawn out 40 demons, including the demons of incest, lewdness, blasphemy, and bestiality. 8 hours of screaming, of having crosses shoved in his mouth, and being yelled at is enough to exhaust anyone, as well as take its toll on your mental state. But remember, he was also tied up for hours before. So when they decided to finish, it was claimed that there was only 3 more left to go. These 3 were the demons of insanity, violence, and murder. Tired from a long night of battling demons, the Reverend thought it would be a good idea to pick it back up when everyone had some rest. But Margaret Smith had tried to get them to continue, because according to her, she got word from God that the demon of murder was about to be unleashed. But they were all tired, so they untied Michael and sent him home with his wife. I honestly do not think that they knew what was going to happen. There was no way that they could have. What was to transpire on the morning of October 6th, I'm sure no one could have predicted. This part is disturbing and graphic. I am still going to censor most of it, but you have been warned. Christine had made arrangements for their 5 kids to be sent to their grandparents for the morning so that Michael and Christine could get some rest. That morning around 9 a.m., neighbors began calling the police. The reason was there was a naked man covered in what they said was red paint walking down the street, maniacally shouting. When the police arrived, they found Michael Taylor walking down the street, naked, but not covered in red paint. He was covered in blood. When asked whose blood was covering him, he just shouted, "It's the blood of Satan." Going to his home, they made a horrifying discovery. One I cannot describe because of YouTube policy. But remember the Florida zombie story from a couple years back? Or the chimp that attacked a woman? Think that, but much worse. They found Christine lying on the floor dead, and also the poodle. And what he did to that poodle is again against YouTube policy. Sorry, I don't make the rules, but be glad I am not sharing the details. This stuff will give you nightmares. And trust me, the police officers entering the scene described it as such. Some had to walk outside to throw up. What he did to his wife, he did with his bare hands. Much like the Florida zombie story. He had gotten undressed and attacked his wife. And he didn't remember anything according to him. He was arrested. He went to court and he was found not guilty by the reason of insanity. He was sent to Broadmoor Hospital for 2 years. Then another 2 years inside another hospital called Bradford. He was then released to the public. From all accounts, he was never in custody of his children. Reverend Peter Vincent was criticized for how he handled the exorcism, and the rules of deliverance, as they call it, were changed. But Reverend Peter Vincent was never punished. He got promoted in the Anglican Church ranks, and this was the last recorded exorcism the Anglican Church ever performed. While normally I would leave it up to the audience to decide for themselves if this was possession or insanity, I feel I need to give my thoughts on this. You have a man who was never into faith, church, or religion, all of a sudden interested in it because of a young woman. He spent a lot of time with her to the point that it was becoming obvious that he was more interested in her than what she was preaching. You have a young woman, who is the object of this man's affection, encouraging it instead of setting boundaries. Then when things get a little bit too weird, she forcefully sets boundaries. Michael Taylor was depressed. He wasn't the man he used to be. Debilitating back pain had left him a shell of the man he was. He sees a young woman that he is attracted to. She gives him attention. And when his wife sees this, she forces the situation to end. Then Marie Robinson rebukes Michael Taylor, shattering the fantasy that he had created. Coming to terms with the reality of the situation, knowing that his life was still going to be one of pain and depression, something snapped inside him. Instead of getting the mental help he needed, a neighbor suggested the best course was still a faith-based alternative, which exorcisms have been known to help the mentally unwell as well, but only if they actually believe that they are possessed. Michael, from all accounts, did think he was possessed, so it should have worked, right? Wrong. Because he was in the room when Reverend Peter Vincent told the group he assembled that there were 3 demons left in him. And he was there when Margaret suggested that they continue because the demon of murder was going to be unleashed. His mental state was already bad. He had been tied up, things shoved in his mouth, screamed at, forced to confess to sins he didn't commit. This exorcism would have caused further mental strain. The suggestion that the demon of murder was about to be unleashed caused his fragile psyche to decide to take all his rage out on the one who stopped him from having that fantasy life, Christine Taylor. Doesn't matter if he was aware of it or not. The minute he left the room and went home with his wife, with the suggestion planted, he was a ticking time bomb. But that is just my opinion. There are some who would read this as possession, and if they believe that, cool. But to me, this is nothing more than a man with a mental illness. Michael Taylor never really recovered from this. He would go on to harm himself 4 different times. One of those, he hurt his back, much worse than it had been before, and also his knee. In 2005, he was arrested for being inappropriate to a young woman. Other than that, there have been no updates to his life. It isn't known if he's still alive, or even if he went back to Ossett, but the darkness of that day, whether he is alive or not, still haunts the community of Ossett. Next week, a reporter who lived a lonely life, and her shocking actions on live television that live in infamy. Christine Chubbuck had a violent end and a tragic life. Till then.